Now, good news coming from the 2018 Nigeria AIDS Indicator and Impact Survey, NAIS, as part of the results shows that Nigeria has dropped to the 4th position in global HIV prevalence rate, despite the 1.9 million persons living with HIV/AIDS in Nigeria. That is certainly wonderful news. Please note that the first case of HIV/AIDS in Nigeria was reported in 1986, and since then, the epidemic has grown steadily from 1.8% in 1991 to 3.8% in 1993, 4.5% in 1995, 5.4% in 1999, and this peaked at 8% in 2001. But this began gradually to reduce from 5.8% to 5% in 2003, and this decline continued to 4.4% in 2005, 4.6% in 2008, and 4.1% in 2010. By 2014, the HIV prevalence rate was 3% to the new level of 1.4%.
Should we clap for Nigeria? Okay, but we still have a long way to go.
Well, we still have a long way to go, but at least we're making babies, taking baby steps.
8% to 1.4%.
And to talk to us about how this has been achieved, we have the DG, the National Agency for the Control of AIDS, Dr. Sani Aliyu, who's joining us from our studio in Abuja. Good morning, Dr. Aliyu.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us this morning. Now, those figures are very encouraging, but how accurate are these figures to start with?
Well, first of all, just to emphasize, the Nigeria AIDS Indicator and Impact Survey is the largest single country HIV-specific survey ever done in the world. So in terms of how reliable are the figures, this is the best data we have when it comes to HIV/AIDS in the country. The methodology was very different. The sample size, we had a sample size of about close to 230,000, whereas previous surveys had sample sizes of not more than 30,000. In addition to this, the population that we looked at was the general population. So we did a household, what we call a household a survey with random sampling across enumeration areas in the country. We even went all the way to Chibok to get data. So in terms of the reliability of the data, this is by far the best HIV data we'll ever have. In a way, what I want people to realize is, rather than comparing previous year's surveys, because you're not really comparing like with like, you're comparing apples with oranges. This survey is very different. Previous surveys have been mostly looking at specific populations, so for instance, antenatal or looking at people at high risk of HIV infection. But this is quite a different set of results altogether. We invested together with our partners, we invested about $90 million US. We delivered it in record time, over 9 months, whereas other African countries, it took them about 3 years to do. And the results essentially show 5 things. The prevalence for HIV for the age group 15 to 49 is 1.4%. which translates to about 1.9 million Nigerians having HIV. Secondly, it also shows that females are at much higher risk of having HIV than men, almost 2 to 1. Really. And then thirdly, in terms of the age group, it's clearly showing that the peak for women is much earlier, between the ages of 35 to 39 in terms of the highest prevalence, compared to men, which is between 50 to 54, which suggests that in Nigeria, the main drivers of the epidemic are either young women or much older men. And this is something that we need to look at and work on. In addition to this, it appears that young women still continue to be at substantial risk for HIV, 3 times that of young men within the same age group of 20 to 24 years. And then finally, the 5th point I wanted to make with the survey is when it comes to virological suppression, which is the impact that the treatment is having on one. It looks like our men either do not know their status or they are not taking their drugs compared to women. So essentially that's what the survey shows. It's going to help us improve the way we deliver our programs. We'll definitely have more efficient investments going in and also more effective planning. So overall, it's a win-win situation for the country. It's really good news. Nigeria has dropped. We actually haven't dropped to number 4. We dropped to number 3 because we are behind, first of all, South Africa, number 1, India, number 2, and Nigeria, number 3. We thought initially that Mozambique had a higher burden, but it looks like Mozambique is following Nigeria at the moment. But nevertheless, it's good news. 1.4% means that it is possible in the next few years for us to get everybody on treatment. We already have 1 million Nigerians on treatment, just over 1 million Nigerians. If we estimate we have 1.9 million with HIV, it means our gap is about 900,000. This coming year alone, the US government with our global fund, we're planning to put about 350,000 people on treatment. So you can see over the next 2 years, if we continue at this same rate, everybody who needs to go on treatment for HIV will be diagnosed and put on treatment. And that's really the aim of government. We really need to get on top of this problem. It's a problem that is now clearly can be resolved. The end is in sight when it comes to the HIV epidemic in Nigeria if we continue to put the resources that we need to put to get on top of it.
Now, let's look at what accounts for this decline. What did we do differently that got us to where we are?
So, a good question. So back in 2010, we had only about 360,000 Nigerians on treatment for HIV. 7-8 years later, we now have over 1 million. We have tripled the number of facilities offering HIV treatment in the last 5-6 years. We have increased testing. In 2016 alone, we tested more than 11 million Nigerians for HIV. So you can see the resources that have been going in have been substantial. Our colleagues in the US government, for instance, have invested more than $5 billion in the last 15 years on HIV alone in Nigeria. Global Fund have invested more than $1 billion. So in a way, what this survey is showing is that all the previous investments that have gone into HIV have not gone to waste. We have made substantial progress as a country. We are now joining the Committee of Nations that are well on the way towards eradicating HIV/AIDS by 2030. It's a really good news for the country, but it's also a reason for us to continue to accelerate, keep our foot on the pedal, continue to push to make sure that we reach that promised land.
Okay, so we have gone from a figure of approximately 3.1 million in 2014 to 1.9 right now. And you say this is wonderful news. It is wonderful news. But how do we intend to maintain this and ensure that new cases don't increase the numbers?
Okay, so if you look at the survey results themselves, what it's showing is that it's a mixed epidemic. There are parts of the country that have a relatively high prevalence, and there are parts of the country that have very low prevalence. So our approach now is going to change. We're going to take states as subnational entities. In terms of the targets for the 90-90-90, which is the 90% need to know their status, 90% of those that know their status are on treatment, and 90% of those are virologically suppressed, we will be going for the high prevalence states and making sure that we achieve that. For states that have a relatively low prevalence, the approach will have to be different. It will really be more in terms of prevention, increasing awareness, making sure that the population within those states, particularly those at high risk of HIV, have adequate knowledge to be able to protect themselves. So in other words, we're going to have a two-track solution for the country. For the low prevalence areas, it's going to be primarily prevention. For the high prevalence areas, our priority will be to diagnose everybody there and put them on treatment.
Now we have 1.9 million people living with the virus. We used to have 3.1 in 2014. What happened to them? Did they get cured? And so I said I was going to ask you this question.
So I will go back again to one of the first statements I made. This survey, it has a completely different methodology to previous surveys. So what we have done is we have recalibrated the HIV epidemic in Nigeria. We had an estimate of 3-point-something million, but this was based on surveys that were not as robust as what we have now. Even if you look at the data for those previous surveys, the confidence interval for the prevalence has always been very wide. So if we said 3.2%, for instance, the confidence interval, that's 95% confidence interval, by which I mean we are 95% certain that the rate will be between 2.5 to maybe 4%. So it's a very wide range, and we tend to give a median. So that was why we said 3.2 million Nigerians may have HIV then. But this time around, we're pretty certain that the numbers are actually much lower. What we have is about 1.9 million Nigerians with HIV. And we are pretty certain that that figure is right, because the survey has been extremely robust. It's been scientifically conducted. We've had independent international monitors coming in. We are not the only country that has done a population-based HIV impact assessment survey. We're the 13th country in sub-Saharan Africa, but we're the country with the largest sample size at the moment, and that's why it's consumed a lot of resources. In terms of planning, you cannot plan without data. Data is what gives you information to prioritize and to be able to have insight into a problem. Previously, we never had the sort of resources we now had through the US government and Global Fund to conduct this sort of survey. So you could look at it very similar to what India did a few years ago. So India, in the same way, recalibrated the epidemic. They applied a new scientific methods to make sure that they've got the right figures for planning. We've always had suspicion that the prevalence for HIV in the country is probably slightly lower than what we have been recording, partly because of the challenges we've had with programming, where some of our partners have been having difficulty picking up persons with HIV in certain parts of the country. This survey, what it shows is that the areas that we thought had HIV still have HIV. The areas that we thought had low HIV prevalence do have a low HIV prevalence, so that's no surprise, but it's the magnitude of the epidemic that has changed. The epidemic is much smaller than we initially thought.
Okay, let's quickly, as we wind this down, mother-to-child transmission of the virus is, one of the areas that we still have to deal with. Is this figure, for PMTCT, is this part of these figures that you have given, or you have a new figure for mother-to-child transmission of the virus?
Yes, absolutely. We'll have different figures. I think it's very likely Nigeria will still continue to be tops when it comes to transmission of HIV from mother to child. But overall, the prevalence in the general population, in a way, also tends to reflect on the antenatal population. Previously, the figures we had for babies being infected was in about 30-something thousand. With this new prevalence figures, it's very likely we'll have about 20-something thousand babies being infected with HIV. But even one baby is too much, really. There's no reason why any baby at this point in time, when we have such effective treatment, should be born with HIV. So we will recalibrate the PMTCT figures, which is prevention of mother-to-child transmission. The good news is, so far, based on the data we have, it looks like a lot more women are now accessing antenatal care. The data we had showed about 4 out of every 5 women we sampled had at least one antenatal care visit, and about 4 out of every 10, 40% of the pregnant mothers knew their status as at the time of the survey. So, which is much better than the 30% that we had before. But yes, we will still continue to need to invest in prevention of mother-to-child transmission. This will continue to be an issue regardless of the final results of the survey.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aliyu. We wish you all the best in your advocacy, such that the numbers don't increase by the next time that we have you on our program talking about the prevalence of HIV/AIDS. Dr. Sani Aliyu, Director General, National Agency for the Control of AIDS.